Hello all, and welcome back to another Hyperblues Top Lists. As you may know, I like to find redeeming qualities in both bad movies and games. You know, a certain something that makes a bad gameplay or a bad movie experience worthwhile in the grand scheme of things. That, unfortunately, isn't always possible. As I mentioned in last month's game review, or second CDI Spotlight, that there's a game I consider to be garbage, and it got me thinking, what other games have I played that I just didn't enjoy? Well, I've come up with 11 games that I absolutely do not enjoy. But before we begin, just an editor's note, I won't include games that are known for being bad, for example, E.T. for the Atari 2600 or Superman 64, for example. We know those games are bad for one reason or another, so why bother listing them here? That being said, here are the top 11 worst games that I have ever played. Number 11. Hey You Pikachu. Now I know I'll get some flack for this, but I'm not a big fan of this game. I always appreciate that Nintendo goes out of its way to innovate, with a few obvious exceptions aside, but innovation for the sake of innovation isn't always a good thing. Case in point, the microphone control for this game is unbearable to me. If I wanted to play a game where I have to constantly tell the person I'm playing with to do something specific, I would just play board games with my kids. Okay, all joking aside, the microphone commands barely work for me. I'd be much happier if the voice commands were optional and you could control Pikachu via the controller. Since I can't control Pikachu, there's really not much game here. The experience is just me watching Pikachu roam around and picking things up, and to me that's not really fun. Next up is Beyond Two Souls. I might get some flack for this one as well, but I don't care. I hate Beyond Two Souls. The visuals are really stunning, but everything else is a train wreck. The story is ridiculous, the acting is awful, the motion capture is spotty at times, and the gameplay isn't really that fun. My recommendation for this game, play through it once. You'll probably enjoy it that way. I did at first. If you're into trophies or achievements like me, you'll probably end up hating it from having to play it so much. You know, everything from the janky motion capture to the nonsensical story to the... Je ne sais quoi. Right, exactly. The only saving grace for this game are the Aiden sections, and even those aren't that fun. My advice? Play Heavy Rain. It also has a ridiculous plot and janky motion capture, but at least it's funny. Next is Vexx. I've only played the GameCube version of Vexx, so I don't know how it does on other consoles. I was interested in this game because of its open-world platforming, but honestly, it falls a bit flat for me. I was hoping for an experience like Super Mario 64, but I'm left with a game that just doesn't deliver. For one, it just doesn't look that polished. Two, the camera is awful. If you need to make a precise jump off of like a pole or a skinny platform, then good luck. Especially in later levels because it's incredibly difficult. Worst of all, you never really know where to go because the game doesn't really provide useful hints. There are arrows to direct a player, but those aren't the most accurate either. To sum up this experience, all I can say is that it feels like the game is constantly doing this to the player. Yeah. Next, WWE 2K20. Okay, so I know that WWE 2K20 is a known bad game, but I had to give it a try. I haven't played a wrestling game in a long time, and I wanted to see how far they have come. I guess I should have just repurchased one of the older games, because they didn't really go that far. To say WWE 2K20 is buggy is an understatement. Apparently, known developer Vexx had left the project with a few weeks left till release date, and another team had to come in and finish the job. That's always a hard task to finish someone else's work when you're not sure where they left off, so I get that there may be some bugs in that regard. But my issue isn't with the bugginess. It's with the gameplay itself. In previous installments, you could, work on your opponent over throughout the entire duration of the match, and your opponent became groggier with more and more damage he or she took. WWE 2K20 changed it so now your opponent can come back pretty much at any point and pick up the win. The computer basically doesn't sell your moves, to put it in wrestling terms. I guess kind of like most wrestling nowadays. Anyway, I'm also still not entirely sure how the move system works either. I know I assigned my created character certain moves, but I don't know how to use them all. The biggest gripe though is that the developers added a minigame to pin situations. If you get pinned, even after the match just starts, and you don't stop the pointer at the exact position on the meter, you lose. It doesn't matter how much stamina your character has, if you screw up that sequence, you lose. That's just downright unforgivable to me. The character designs are also abysmal. While scrolling through the roster, I couldn't help but notice how most characters looked identical to one another and none of them look like who they're supposed to. With all that being said, the reason WWE 2K20 isn't higher on this list is because, once you get used to the awful controls, the game is somewhat playable. You just have to constantly deal with the issues I mentioned already, which isn't fun at all. Next up is Psychokiller. I love point-and-click games. I also love games with FMV in it. Psychokiller doesn't do well with either of those genres. I have a review on Psychokiller and what I don't like about it, link in the description, so I won't repeat all those details here. Long story short, it's a short game that is prolonged with instant deaths around every corner, unskippable cutscenes, and has a non-existent soundtrack. If it weren't for the funny death animations, I would say skip this altogether. Although, if you're interested in those funny death animations, you can check out my Psychokiller playlist that contains most of them. And there's my shameless plug. Next, number 6, Amy. Amy tried really hard to bring something new to the third-person zombie shooter genre, and in a few ways it did. Unfortunately for Amy though, the game isn't fun. The controls are cumbersome, and the entire game plays like an escort mission where the main character has to keep her daughter safe from the baddies roaming around. You can hide the daughter when you want to engage in combat, but walking too far away from her causes the mother to become infected by the contagion in the air. The worst part about Amy? The game's boring. It's not a fun game and I don't recommend it. I would, however, recommend checking out someone else's playthrough if you're interested. Up next is Deliriant. So I'm jumping the gun a little bit on this list. I have a review for Deliriant lined up for sometime this year, but I just had to get the game on this list. As I mentioned in my Ether 1 review, I like walking simulators. A good walking simulator has an immersive environment and a story that unfolds as you explore it. Deliriant doesn't really have either of those. I have no clue what Deliriant is about, besides from what I've read on the store page. Gameplay-wise, Deliriant is alright. There are some trippy effects that happen as you progress, and that's pretty cool. Story-wise though, Deliriant is a miss. The game is also very short, but for a game that's roughly $1, that's not a bad thing. It's honestly a game that really would have benefited from some voice acting. Next is number 4, Hashigami, Ruining Blue Earth. Hashigami has got to be the worst tactical RPG I've ever played. I have a very strict standard when it comes to tactical RPGs. If it isn't like Final Fantasy Tactics for the PlayStation 1, it isn't good. Okay, I'm kidding of course, but Final Fantasy Tactics is my gold standard because the story is great, the gameplay is immersive, and there are a ton of unlockables. Hoshigami, on the other hand, isn't fun. Every battle took me over an hour to complete, and that was mostly because the characters kept missing each other. Seriously, attacks seem to only land about 25% of the time, and that's only when you're facing the enemy's back. I couldn't seem to figure out how to make attacks land or how to really play the game in general. Normally in situations like this, I would turn to Game Shark or Action Replay to, try to enhance my gameplay experience, but there weren't even any Game Shark or Action Replay codes to max out character stats. When Game Shark or Action Replay can't make your game more enjoyable or even playable, then you don't have a good game on your hands. Bottom line, play Final Fantasy Tactics. Next. Number 3 is Dark Castle for the CDI. I just reviewed Dark Castle last week and called it garbage in that review. I'll sum up my feelings on this mess of a game in one clip. Seriously, the gameplay mechanics are awful in the CDI version of Dark Castle. So much so that I honestly have no idea how to really play it. Dark Castle for the CDI is not fun, and is downright aggravating to play. Check out my review for a more in-depth analysis. Up next is Professional Farmer, American Dream. This shouldn't surprise anyone that is subscribed to me. Professional Farmer American Dream is the one game that holds the lowest score amongst all of my reviews. Professional Farmer American Dream was shipped unfinished and abandoned shortly after. No real attempts were made to fix this buggy mess. Professional Farmer American Dream isn't fun to play, and it sometimes doesn't even allow the player to play it. It's a game that doesn't need to exist from a publisher that doesn't deserve your money. Again, check out my review for a more in-depth analysis. So if the lowest ranking game out of all my reviews isn't number 1, then what is? Must be something terrible, and trust me, it is. Number 1, The Letter for Wii U. The letter is what happens when an Indiegogo isn't funded, but the game doesn't get scrapped. Honestly, The Letter is a great game if you want to sit around with a group of friends and riff on it. It's not great, however, if you're looking for a good horror game. The Letter doesn't even have any jump scares in it. I mean, how hard is that to create? The visuals are also terrible. Nothing about The Letter is scary, but a lot of things are bizarre to say the least. The scenes in which the player finds themselves in are also bizarre. You get to explore places such as this house, an abandoned construction site, and a rundown town. The graphics are atrocious and are honestly not scary at all. The soundtrack is also bad. It's minimalistic at best and doesn't have any memorable qualities. In fact, I forgot that the game even had a soundtrack until I played it again to record the footage. The only blessing for The Letter is that it's very short. I'm being serious, you can actually beat it within 5 to 10 minutes, especially after one playthrough. The whole game revolves around the player searching for letters and other collectibles, and the letters and collectibles don't move on separate playthroughs. If you don't get all the collectibles, then you're treated to the bad end? Honestly, I'm not that sure. The quote-unquote true ending is more confusing than anything, but to be fair, there really isn't much of a story here. The Letter is a first-person horror game that doesn't have any scares in it, doesn't have a real plot, looks bad, doesn't make sense, is all around boring, and doesn't play well. And it's for all these reasons that The Letter tops off this list as the worst game that I've ever played. So what are some of the worst games that you've ever played? Let me know down in the comments, and as always, thank you for watching.